Here's my fundamental concern with Protestantism, and I would like to see some interaction from um, Protestants on this matter, because for me, this is a difficulty that I don't think Protestants can overcome. And it's one of the reasons why I don't believe that Protestantism is a viable option for um, determining what Jesus actually taught. Now, that might sound overly rhetorical itself. That might just sound like, oh, wow, that's just too much. No, let me explain why. I'm well aware that Protestants and Catholics share the vast majority of the canon of Scripture together. So, insofar as we share that together, they have access to the message of Jesus. But what I'm saying is, in order for them to establish their position, they have to borrow from the Catholic paradigm, but then they turn around and deny the very Catholic paradigm that they're borrowing from. So the very ground that they're standing on, they cut out from themselves. And so my perspective is that Protestantism is inherently and ultimately illogical. I'm not saying that every individual that maintains it is illogical. What I'm saying is the system itself refutes itself. And here's what I mean. Let me get into the actual details, the nitty gritty here, instead of just speaking, generally. Let me tell you why I think this is the case. Let's just pretend for a moment I'm not a Catholic, right? I'm not. Let's just say I'm a skeptic, and I go to Christians, people who identify as Christians, Catholics, Protestants, whatever, just anyone who identifies themselves as a Christian. And I, as an agnostic, ask, okay, well, I'm not asking the question, why should I believe the message of Jesus? That's not what I'm asking. So please get that out of your head. I'm asking a different question. I'm asking, why should I believe that your claim that the New Testament is an accurate telling of what Jesus taught? Why should I believe that? So again, the question is not why should I believe the message of the New Testament? That's not the question. The question I'm asking is, why should I believe that the New Testament is a reliable witness to what Jesus actually taught? Since Jesus didn't write anything down, he didn't leave us any books or something like that, we have to rely on what others say about him. So my question is, okay, you're, especially a Protestant, is going to refer me to the New Testament, in particular the four Gospels, right? So let's just maybe stick with the four Gospels and let's talk about Protestantism. And then I'm going to present the same question to the Catholic perspective, and I think that will draw out my concern. If I were to ask a Protestant, why would I maintain the four Gospels? What I generally hear is, well, these are historically attested to as reliable, witnesses to what Jesus actually taught. There's historical evidence that this is a reliable account. Okay, but I can also point to just as early and contemporary documents that are gospels that also purport to be the words of Jesus, but a Protestant wouldn't accept. Since again, Gnostics, for example, would put forward certain Gnostic scriptures. I'm not talking about some of the ones that were after the Apostolic period, but some of the message at the very least, even if it wasn't in scripture rated, but the message that they were proclaiming about what Jesus is saying was certainly contemporary to some of these gospels. So if there are other people out there also saying that, hey, this is actually what Jesus taught, and it's very different, I then have to say, okay, well, just merely appealing to something that's really early doesn't do it for me. Because just simply antiquity alone doesn't really get us to the four Gospels, because there are other accounts of Jesus that are early as well. And so that's not going to be a sufficient standard, just merely appealing to antiquity. I think it's important. I think it's helpful. I mean, something that comes in the year 200, I think is less likely to be accurate compared to something that appears in the 60s or 70s, So I think that there's some merit to appealing to antiquity. But again, that alone doesn't settle it. And it's Robert Eno, the Catholic scholar and historian Robert Eno, who rightly notes in his preface to the work on the Message of the Fathers series, Teaching Authority in the Church Fathers, he rightly notes in the preface that Gnostics also appealed to their own versions of Scripture and their own claims to apostolic teaching that conflicted with the four Gospels, for example. So what do we do there? He kind of asks the question, what were Orthodox Christians supposed to say in response to the Gnostics, because they were also claiming certain books that they consider canonical and certain messages about Jesus that they considered apostolic that were just as early as the four Gospels and what it accounts for and what it says about Jesus and his message. So again, merely pointing me to, you have a whole bunch of people who accept the four Gospels really early on. I have to say, wait, you're assuming what has to be proven, and that is you're going to point me to these Orthodox Christians who accepted the four Gospels. But why are you pointing me to them? Why aren't you pointing me to the Gnostics? So just to me, you're assuming that the Orthodox Christian community is actually just that, Orthodox. Maybe it's those who are the heretics, and maybe it's the Gnostics who have the right teaching, right? So again, merely pointing me to a reception of the four Gospels really early on, that doesn't mean much, because received by whom? Well, received by Orthodox Christians. Okay, but am I not trying to determine what is Orthodox Christianity? What is a reliable witness? You can't just say, oh, these guys. So again, that doesn't work. So when it boils down to a consideration of Protestantism, I don't think that it is able to stand on its own 2 feet, as the expression goes. I don't think that it's able to establish a case for itself. I think it's only able to respond to Catholicism and assume certain things from the Catholic paradigm to establish itself, but then undermine the very logic behind the paradigm that it accepted. And here's what I mean by that. Let me ask then the question to a Catholic, and then I will compare those two and show you why I don't think that Protestantism is able to establish its own case, and I think it's internally inconsistent and contradictory. If I were to ask a Catholic, okay, well, what is the actual message of Jesus, right? And why would I believe that your 4 Gospels, for example, are a reliable account of the message of Jesus? Why would I believe that? I'm not asking why should I believe the 4 Gospels in the message of Jesus. I'm asking why would I believe that the 4 Gospels is a reliable account of what Jesus said? Now, whether or not I should believe what Jesus says is a different thing. But how do I know this actually testifies to what Jesus taught, in other words? So if you were to ask that question to a Catholic, they're going to repeat the same thing that Irenaeus taught in the 2nd century against the Gnostics, who were, again, also claiming to have access to what Jesus taught and to the true apostolic message. Irenaeus, as I've mentioned before in previous shows, what his argument is, in summary, and this is again in Against Heresies, specifically, books 3 through 5. His objection or his response is, well, you look at the message of those people who go back in actual succession to the apostles themselves. The apostles, we all agree, were the, disciples of Jesus, historically speaking. We all agree on that. Okay, well, how do I get back to that apostolic message as being since we're going to say, okay, well, the people that Jesus taught, those are going to be reliable guides to what Jesus himself taught, because they're his disciples, they're his students. So how do I get access to what the apostles taught? Because Jesus didn't write anything down, but the apostles went out and preached and proclaimed the message. How do I get access to that? Because once I get access to that apostolic message, I can then say that's a reliable guide to what Jesus taught, because Jesus taught these apostles. And Gnostics and Orthodox Christians are in agreement that yes, it's true. Apostles are reliable guides to what Jesus taught. But again, both are claiming to have the apostolic message, and they have contradictory canons, contradictory scriptures, contradictory messages. So just that mere appeal to just go to the apostolic teaching isn't going to work. How do I identify what is apostolic teaching is the question now. All right, so what Irenaeus wants to do is he wants to say, well, those apostles, we know historically founded churches. They established churches. They actually set up churches. And what they did is they ordained men in those communities to preach and govern and teach and pass on their apostolic message, which is a divine message. It's a message that goes back to Jesus. They entrusted them to pass it on. And then those teachers ordained successors to hand on and carry out and continue to proclaim that same apostolic message. And that happens all the way into the present, again, through apostolic succession. And we can identify it through the churches that the apostles established. That was Irenaeus's response to the Gnostics. And what we see as a difference between the two, and Robert Eno again points this out in his preface, the Gnostics were claiming to have the true message of Jesus, but they couldn't point you to anything tangible to prove that. They could just say, oh, well, here's our scriptures, or here's our message. But anybody can say that their message is the message of the apostles. Anybody can say that. What Irenaeus was doing is he was actually locating the message of the apostles in something objectively verifiable. And that is the churches that the apostles established. This is something that is a historical fact. We can go to these churches that they established, and we can see that they ordained men in succession, and these ordinations go back to the apostles. So he roots his claim in something objectively verifiable, historically. So one is able to historically verify Irenaeus's claims, whereas one is not able to historically verify the Gnostic claim, which is why they died out. I mean, they just could not, they could not substantiate their claims. Whereas Orthodox or Catholic Christians, here I'm using small o, small c, right? Orthodox Christians were able to root their claims in something objective, apostolic succession. And so then again, those churches that are established by the apostles, they took that message of the apostles, and they handed down the scriptures that the apostles wrote down. And then some of the scriptures were written down by actual people who were companions of the apostles, if you will, disciples of the apostles. So some of them weren't actually written by apostles, but were, apostolic men. They were people who were around the apostles. So, for example, the Gospel of Mark. So, again, those churches that have this, historically and objectively verifiable trace back to the apostles, those churches took the actual writings of the apostles and transmitted them in their communities. And again, some of their disciples, such as, Mark, they also wrote down things, and those were too transmitted in these Orthodox churches. And so we can go to the community that has that objectively verifiable claim to the apostolic message. We can go to that community and ask them, hey, what is the message that the apostles proclaimed? And we would see what that message is in their teaching, in their preaching, and also in the books that they consider to be canonical, they consider to be scripture. So again, the Catholic claim there is, okay, here's how you can identify it. You can look at the preaching, and you can look at the scriptures of the very community that can objectively trace back to, through apostolic succession, the apostles. Whereas again, Gnostics weren't able to do that. And I want to say the same is also true of Protestants. They're in the same position as the Gnostics, though they don't maintain some of the distinctives of Gnosticism. They're in the same epistemic difficulty because they don't generally claim apostolic succession. You might have some high church Anglicans that might testify to that, but I'm going to put them out of this discussion in a moment, and I'll just say that I'm talking about the vast majority of Protestants who deny apostolic succession. I'm not referring to a few who maintain apostolic succession. I'd have to deal with them differently. So those Anglicans that would maintain apostolic succession, this isn't in response to them. This isn't a critique of them necessarily. I would have to take a different approach with them. So again, the point is this. Protestants are telling me, okay, we'll go to these four gospels. All right. Why should I believe those four gospels are a reliable account? The Catholic gave me an objective way to say that those four gospels are a reliable account of Jesus and the apostles and what they taught. The Catholic gave me an objectively verifiable way to identify that. The Protestant's not giving me something objectively identifiable, a way to actually ground those claims. What they're doing is they're going to those Christian communities that do maintain apostolic succession and saying, look, they received these four gospels as reliable accounts of what Jesus taught. But they're having to go to the apostolic churches to do that. But then they turn around and say, but I deny apostolic succession. That's what I mean by it's inherently illogical and contradictory. It doesn't make sense. Because the very basis that we use to determine the four gospels, apostolic succession, is the very thing that you're now denying, but then you maintain those four gospels. So Protestantism is not able to stand on its own 2 feet. All it's able to do is borrow from others, but then deny the very logic behind the thing that they're borrowing. Which is why, respectfully, I'm not trying to be mean. This is how I objectively see Protestantism, not individual Protestants, but objectively the way I see Protestantism is, it's like a person who borrows my car and then wants to loan it back to me and then thinks that he never borrowed it from me to begin with and it's his car to loan back to me. It's like, wait, that was my car to begin with. What are you doing here? That's the Protestant, because what they do is they borrow our canon. They borrow our gospels, which is based on, again, historically rooted in apostolic succession. They then borrow those gospels and then want to read them back to us as a refutation of our own position, all the while rejecting apostolic succession. It's inherently illogical in my estimation, unless a Protestant is able to objectively root their claims in something verifiable historically. And again, the only thing that they can point me to that's verifiable historically is pointing me to those churches that have apostolic succession that goes, back to the apostles. And that's, again, borrowing from my paradigm. Now, they would be more consistent if they maintained apostolic succession. Then we would say, okay, now we have to take it to a different direction, because there are others who maintain apostolic succession, such as Eastern Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox, the Syrian Church of the East, and some Anglicans. There are those who maintain or claim to maintain, at the very least, apostolic succession. So is that argument that I'm using here, and is Irenaeus's argument sufficient at that point? No, it's not. It is sufficient for those who deny apostolic succession and can't give me something that's an alternative to historically verify their claims objectively. But it's not sufficient in those cases. In those cases, to then say, okay, here's how we identify which one is right among communities that have apostolic succession. I think ultimately you have to root that in the claim of whether or not there actually was in the New Testament era a papacy established. And so I think we have to go to that direction. But again, that's immaterial to what I'm discussing here, because I'm more focusing on Protestants who deny apostolic succession. So that's my concern. That's why I also don't believe that I could seriously entertain Protestantism as a option to historical Christianity, in the sense that when you really work through Protestantism, I don't think it has an objectively verifiable claim to the message of Jesus. I can speak of Protestantism as historical Christianity in the sense that it has preserved, some of the teachings of the message of Jesus, but it only does so by borrowing from the Catholic paradigm, or at least from the apostolic churches. So in that sense, I could say, okay, well, it carries on the message of Jesus to an extent, right? Clearly, I think that there are some deficiencies with Protestantism, but to an extent, they do have some truths about the gospel message and the truths about Jesus. And that is because they maintain the New Testament canon. But again, they only maintain it by appealing to a community that I think they ultimately have to then undermine. So unless a Protestant can really give me something to root their claims in that's more verifiable, to the degree that apostolic succession is verifiable. So to the degree that apostolic succession is verifiable, if they can give me a comparable or comparable alternative that is not rooted in apostolic succession, but shows me that they have a reliable transmission of the message of Jesus, I'm all ears. And I think that at that point, Protestantism should then be truly considered, as a viable alternative to orthodoxy. I'm sorry, to Catholicism. That doesn't mean that I think that it's sufficient. I'm just saying it would be in the same category of those who have apostolic succession. In other words, if I were to look at the different communities right now, and I were just a non-Christian or something, I think I could only entertain the ones that had apostolic succession. I don't think that I could entertain Protestantism for this reason. I think I could entertain the Syrian Church of the East, Oriental Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, Catholics, Eastern Catholics. I think I could entertain those because they have apostolic succession. I could even entertain High Church Anglicanism insofar as it claims to maintain apostolic succession. I'm not commenting on Apostolic Curia or anything. I'm just saying insofar as it claims, and I'm looking at it as a non-Catholic. However, if a Protestant were able to root their claims in something that's more objectively verifiable on the level of apostolic succession, I could then say they have a seat at the table. They're in the same category. Until then, I just don't see them in the same category. And that's not to speak about people's intentions. That's not to speak bad about their sincerity. I'm just saying epistemically whether or not I could seriously entertain Protestantism as a viable witness to the message of Christ. Whenever I then ask, is it borrowing from someone else's paradigm or not? Again, they do have access to the truth insofar as they borrow from Catholicism. But it's, again, that scenario of you're borrowing from Catholicism, but then undermining the very logic that was used to maintain the canon of Scripture and the four Gospels. Again, this is the logic that Irenaeus used to establish the message of Jesus, and that's the logic that's used to identify the canon of Scripture. Because there are other scriptures that are out there that are contemporary to the Gospels that are not canonical. Some of them are benign, and some of them are corrupt and detract from the message of Jesus if we have already accepted the canon of the apostolic churches. So I hope that was helpful in articulating my biggest concern with Protestantism. I think if a Protestant could work through that and show me where I've missed the mark, or where my concerns aren't warranted, or where they are inconsistent, then I would have a more stance that sees Protestantism as historically verifiable. So again, I appreciate y'all watching this. I got to get going here in just a moment. We got another show coming up here in just a little bit. We're going to be doing a show with, like I said, Father Deacon Jeff on the Byzantine liturgy and its history, coming up in just an hour. So I'm going to head out, take care of some things, and come back for that. So y'all make sure to check that out. So stay tuned for it. Look for, actually, I think the link is already up, so it should already be on YouTube. So go ahead and check on that. And that's going to do it. I'll see y'all in an hour. See you later. God bless.